Good morning. I am Jan DeVault, the president of the San Jacinto Battleground Conservancy and your official greeter this morning. It is my great privilege to welcome you to our 12th Battle of San Jacinto Symposium. During the 12 years we have held this event, we have had some outstanding speakers, and it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. Several of you have asked me this morning why we're not at the University of Houston. The University of Houston, we tried every which way, had conflicts every Saturday in April. Next year, we are planning to return to U of H, but the big conflict they had this Saturday was with an alumni group, both for the afternoon and the evening. So the Houston Club, which is where we maintain an office, offered this to us, and we said, okay, we'll take it. But it may be actually more fitting, since we're going to be talking about historic preservation, to be here in this building. The club itself was formed in 1894, and they moved into this building in 1955, and this is the last building in Houston that Jesse Jones built. Last year, the building was actually bought by a group of Swedish people, and it is slated to be torn down, and all of the occupants will have to leave by January 31st, 2013, which is just next year. So this room cannot be used again for another event like this, and it's kind of sad. I think they're talking about building another parking lot, but that's the way it is. There are also some people that we should recognize. I'd like to actually start with the board of the San Jacinto Battle Conservancy. We are actually run by a board of 12 people, and I'm going to ask these people to stand. And just, if you'd stand for a moment, and then I'm going to ask our symposium committee to stand. Jeff Dunn, Cecil Jones, David Britton, Lucy Martin, David Singleton, Joe Nelson, Charlie Duke, Barbara Eves, Joe Francis Greenlaw, Greg Dimmick, and George Gale. This is the board of directors of the San Jacinto Battleground Conservancy. And also the symposium committee, and you can read the names on the program, and I'm going to just read them very quickly because they do yeoman's work in helping us to fulfill our mission every year. David Britton, Dave Singleton, Trevia Beverly, James Davis, Barbara Eves, Cliff Gillick, Joe and Eva Golding, Joe Francis Greenlaw, Will Haddock, Will Howard, Frank Koflat, Lisa Struthers, Vaughn, and Loretta Williams. And then also, I don't want to overlook our sponsors and our donors and our patrons who go above and beyond in making this event possible. We're also, I have to say, very grateful to you. We know some of you have come a long way, either by plane or drove in this morning, and you are very important to us, and we want to thank you for coming. I suspect that you're all here because you have and share with all of us a great love and common interest in Texas history. And I have to say, in my case, it's very much a family affair. I have a mother who was born March the 2nd, which is Texas Independence Day, Sam Houston's birthday. Her maiden name is Houston, and she is a distant cousin of the great general. I have a grandson that was born on March 2nd. I have a sister that was born October 2nd, which was Gonzales Day. And I was actually born April the 21st, which is San Jacinto Day. So I had a lot of Texas flags flying in my past. And to boot, I had a degree, and I graduated from college with a degree in history. And what do you do with a degree in history when you don't want to go to graduate school? I became a petroleum landman. And a petroleum landman, what you're actually doing is you're dealing with the soil, you're dealing with the land, you're dealing with landscapes. And I was telling Phil McCormick, I have probably eaten in every little cafe, Martin, Dawson, chicken fried steak, and it gives you a great love and appreciation for the history of this land, and particularly these vast and wonderful skies that are Texas. About 20 years ago, I joined actually the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, the San Jacinto chapter. And the San Jacinto chapter of the DRT was founded in 1891, and it has been long involved with the San Jacinto battleground. And you'll hear more about that story this morning. The role of this group saving the battleground was recognized very early by the state of Texas. In fact, in 1907, then Governor Campbell appointed a member of the San Jacinto chapter to a commission with two other public members, two other individuals, which was called the San Jacinto Park Commission. And along with a park superintendent, in 1910, they actually opened the state park. In 1915, this San Jacinto Park Commission became the San Jacinto Battleground Commission, and in 1965, it became the San Jacinto Historical Advisory Board. And that's when the park came under the responsibility of Texas Parks and Wildlife. Throughout these permutations, the governor very often appointed a member of the San Jacinto chapter of the DRT to this board commission. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this in a minute. But I was president of the San Jacinto chapter of the Daughters in the late 1990s when I was approached by J.C. Martin, the executive director of the San Jacinto Museum of History. He asked me to take a look at the master plan that had been developed for the battlefield, and then to help him get the endorsement for the master plan from the DRT before the plan was actually considered for formal adoption by Texas Parks and Wildlife. What J.C. told me was that over the years, the battleground had become a popular picnic ground, but there was no interpretation of the battle except for the granite boulders placed there by the San Jacinto chapter in 1912. In 1994, the museum and Texas Parks and Wildlife formed a joint committee composed of members of the museum board and members of TPWD. And I know Ann Hamilton was involved in that, and I think Terry Hershey at that time was a member of Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission. And with the aid of the foundations in Houston, the museum was able to raise $350,000 in private funding. TPWD kicked in another $50,000, and they were able to hire nationally recognized consultants to lead in this planning process. These planners felt that the battleground deserved a fresh look at its existing resources before it could be made a premier national historic site that would be consistent with the importance of what took place there in 1836. They eventually came to the conclusion that the battleground should be returned to the extent feasible to its 1836 appearance and condition so that visitors could understand the battle and how such an unlikely event could have taken place at the site. It was obvious to them that the monument could not be moved, but other elements like the unfinished reflection pool, occupying a vast area over which the Texas Army marched into battle, could be covered. A large number of unrelated battle markers could be relocated, and 20th century trash trees and brush could be removed in favor of restoring the native grasses that were there at the time of the battle. When J.C. Martin gave me the master plan to review, and I had time to absorb what it said, I was struck with that emphasis that was placed on the battleground, the landscape, the land. And it occurred to me, in the world of historic preservation, there is one fundamental question that must be answered before all others. Why was the site preserved in the first place? While there's a long story behind the struggle to preserve the battlefield of San Jacinto, the answer to the basic question is clear. The site was preserved because it is where the Republic of Texas won its independence from Mexico on April 21st, 1836. Nothing that has happened since then can change, alter, or add to that simple fact. The battlefield is not a story about the United States and its wars. There are many other historic sites that tell those stories. San Jacinto is the story of an entirely different nation in an entirely different century, the Republic of Texas, and how it won its independence. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there was the San Jacinto Historical Advisory Board, and the governor had the option, if he chose, to appoint someone who was a San Jacinto chapter member to this advisory board. And in 1999, I found myself sleeping on that, or it's not your fault, Jeff, I was sleeping. Jeff was the chairman of the San Jacinto Historical Advisory Board. I found myself on that board. In the summer, Jeff Dunn and I met with several others, including TPW officials in Austin, to discuss what we would call at that time a desirable facility boundary for the San Jacinto battleground. This meeting had been precipitated by the fact that a Ukrainian gentleman had recently tried to purchase 19 acres abutting the state acreage, which was just north of the battleship Texas, for the purpose of building a battery acid facility on land, and we were told this would employ 800 people. From that meeting with TPWD, we took away the basic idea of developing guidelines and goals for the historic, aesthetic, cultural conservation of San Jacinto, and very shortly after, the meeting was actually in July, very shortly after we formed this organization in September. Fortunately, the plans for the battery acid plant fell through, and we were able to purchase, as the San Jacinto Battleground Conservancy, those 19 acres in 2010. The area around the battleground has changed dramatically since 1836. Development of the Houston Ship Channel and the aggressive expansion of the petrochemical industry have eroded the rural and pastoral setting that would have been familiar to a 19th century Texan. Today, the San Jacinto Battleground sits in the midst of one of the largest petrochemical complexes in the world. There are over 46 industrial facilities immediately surrounding the site, including major oil refineries and chemical storage facilities. In 2010, Preservation Texas named the San Jacinto Battleground to its most endangered list. They stated that they were concerned about the preservation of the entire site of the known battleground and the impact future development would have on the area. Now, what we discovered in our short nonprofit life is that being a preservation organization is not an easy road. One of our roles that has basically fallen to us is serving as a voice for the battlefield, advocates for the battlefield. And much like Socrates, who was a gadfly of Athens, we have somehow made ourselves into the gadflies of San Jacinto. And as you know, gadflies are not very popular, particularly sometimes with the stewards of the site, which is Texas Parks and Wildlife. And Texas Parks and Wildlife has some of the most wonderful and dedicated employees who work so hard for our citizens, and they have tremendous courage, and that was very clearly demonstrated this past summer with the wildfires and the drought that devastated so much of Texas and so many of our parks. They are financially strapped, both from a human resource standpoint and a financial resource standpoint. And we are so supportive of their mission and what they are trying to do. In fact, I'm very pleased that Michael Strutt, who's a cultural resource director of Texas Parks and Wildlife, is going to be our luncheon speaker. But when we got into the realm of battlefield advocacy and issues that require complex review and processes, I am very sure that there are people at Texas Parks and Wildlife that would wish that we could be condemned to drink hemlock. But We are still here. And in fact, I do have to tell you, one incident that was actually, looking at it now, is very, very humorous. But in the commissioners, Texas Parks and Wildlife commissioners, all signed a letter in May of 2010 addressed to Senators Cornyn, U.S. Senators Cornyn and Hutchison, to help them expedite. They wanted their help in expediting 2 federal review processes. One was for the visitor center, proposed visitor center, and one was for the Battleship Texas Dry Berth project. In the letter from the commissioners to the 2 U.S. senators, we were accused of playing the system to delay the process because we philosophically refused to accept decisions made by the legislature, quote unquote. And all of us on our board and our organization, I don't think we've had a speeding ticket since the time we were 16 or 17 years old, even though Jeff Dunn could have gotten one yesterday. Like Socrates, we continue to ask the very hard questions about the battleground and how these wonderful resources should best be preserved for future generations. It's a very complex site that involves 2 National Historic Landmarks. We believe we need to take a holistic look at the battleground. We hope this symposium, this conference, will be a stepping stone for dialogue and pave the way for a series of meaningful, intelligent conversations focused on battlefield preservation issues. In order to do this, we realize that we may all have to shed some of our old viewpoints and attitudes that would prevent us from finding the best possible plans going forward. And it will require a lot of compromise and consideration of all ideas. But it's very important we don't lose sight of the fact, our ultimate goal, to do what is in the best long-term interest of the development of these sites for the people of the state of Texas. Now, having said all of this, once again, I want to thank you for being here. And it's my turn to turn the program over to Professor Jim Crisp, who has attended all of our symposias, so whatever, including this one, and he's been the moderator for 10 of them, including this one. And Jim, thank you for coming all the way from North Carolina State University to be with us this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Crisp.
Thank you very much, Jan. I wouldn't miss this for the world. I was, as I told someone this morning, I was one of the speakers at the first San Jacinto Symposia, or whatever. I was a heckler at the second one. And in order to keep, Steve Hutton was on the podium. I had to be a heckler. And then in order to keep me from doing that in subsequent symposia, they made me moderator for life. So I can't heckle except from this podium, and that cramps my style quite a bit. And I want to thank Jeff Dunn for badgering me in 2001 until I agreed to be a speaker, because it really has been a really remarkable part of my professional career to be here at these symposia. I can't begin to tell you how much they've helped my career and how much fun they've been. And if you can have fun advancing your career, you're in a good position. After talking to other people today, I know, and I already knew this, just how much lure and fascination the past, and especially the Texan past, has for so many people. Of course, there's a problem. As I tell my students in my methodology class, after I ask them to raise their hands if they're interested in the past, and some of you have heard this before, when they all dutifully raise their hands, after all, there they are in a historical methodology class, I say, oh, you're interested in the past? Well, too damn bad. It's gone. And you can't touch it, and you can't see it, and you can't hear it, and you can't feel it. All you've got are these vestiges that we have of the past. And we also have images of the past We have both vestiges that the past has left us, and we have images of the past that we've created in our effort to approximate that past, to represent or represent that past. The great Haitian anthropologist and historian Michel Rolfe-Trouillot says that there are two kinds of history, or since English is his third language, he was able to see that in the English language, history really has two meanings. One is what happened in the past, and the other is what is said to have happened in the past. And I torture my graduate students a great deal with this dichotomy. I'm not going to do that today. I want to look at the second of those, though. What is said to have happened in the past. What is said to have happened in the past really falls into kind of two categories today. One is the academic and scholarly discipline of history, based, or at least should be based, on evidence and on logic. But as Michel Rolfe-Trouillot has told us, most history is not produced by historians. Most history is produced by other players in our culture, movie directors, magazine cover artists, painters, poets, community committees commemorating the history of their city or their county. And history based on evidence and logic is sometimes up against memory, as historians tend to talk about it, the collective memory, the public memory, infused with both myth and emotion and a sense of self-identity and a sense sometimes, all too often, of don't confuse me with the facts. I know what I want to believe. The beauty of preservation of historic sites is that we have an opportunity in historic sites like the San Jacinto battlefield to bring these two aspects of history together. The scholarly and academic history, the history based on documentary evidence and on archaeology, the specific tangible evidence that we have of the past, together with the emotion and the sense of self-identity and the identification with a great formative myth. And by the way, I don't mean falsehood by myth. I mean myth is a kind of simplified and distilled version of history which is used to infuse values and identity. It works best if it's somehow congruent with the facts, but it's never as Catholic, to use the small c word, in its use of the facts as more academic history. There are lots of inconvenient truths for both the Mexican approach to the San Jacinto battlefield and the Texan approach to the San Jacinto battlefield. Neither one are the complete truth. And for many years, what we've tried to do in the San Jacinto Symposium is to bring together as many documented facts as we can to show the true complexity of what's going on in Texas in 1835-36. It's no simple story. Sometimes four guys with their rifles over the wall, all fighting on the same side, have different ideas in their head about what they're fighting for. Some are American agents like Sam Houston. Some are Mexican Federalists. And I could go down the list of others. You know, some are outraged settlers. Some are land speculators and slave smugglers. There are a lot of different motives and a lot of different things going on at the same time. But to get back to the preservation of historic sites, it may be that historic sites, more powerfully than any other phenomenon in our culture, have the power to bring together and let each influence the other, the academic side of history and the popular side of history, so that history and memory can come together and reinforce each other. And that's the kind of thing we're going to be talking about today, how a place like San Jacinto can be both a place of memory for the public and a place of genuine history. And we're going to hear from various people today about what gives this place its significance, Paul Andrew Hutton, better than probably anyone else in the country, has been able to bring together scholarly and academic history with the task of bringing history to the public and talking in public venues, in magazines like the American West, and in documentaries in every channel you've seen. I think probably even on I don't know, the Food Channel, you'll probably see Hutton someplace talking about the history of tamales. But seriously, Paul has been able to bring significance to people in a way that attracts the public interest, and you're going to be fortunate to hear him today, and we're very fortunate to have him today. We're also going to hear about very specific actions on the battlefield, and those specific actions are important. We were out at the Lynchburg Ferry yesterday, and Jeff Dunn, who along with David Pomeroy is today going to be talking about some of those very specifics, can talk about those specific places and specific actions in a way that allows you to see the larger picture, the strategy. Why are people converging on the Lynchburg Ferry? What is Sam Houston thinking as he retreats and then pounces? What is Santa Anna thinking? Why here? Why now? Why at this place? We're also going to be seeing the artifacts that archaeologists like Greg Dimick and Douglas Mangum have brought up from these sites to show us that, well, maybe perhaps we were wrong about where Almonte surrendered, and maybe we were wrong about exactly what the boundaries of the battlefield were, and that we better understand the actions of the past, and we better commemorate the past, and we better honor those places if we understand where those places actually were, and allow the factual history coming from those artifacts to infuse and augment the stories that we've heard all of our lives. We also have people whose lives are devoted to historical preservation, like Chris McMasters, like Michael Strutt, who are going to be talking to us about some of the dilemmas that are faced by people who would want to preserve the past in the most effective way and to preserve these sites of memory, these places of memory like the San Jacinto battlefield, in a way that best informs and educates the people who come. And sometimes that means dealing with previous commemoratives, commemorative events, commemorative sites, big boulders, all kinds of things that may not be quite right. And it also means, as I learned by seeing the San Jacinto battleground through new eyes and walking around it with Chris McMasters yesterday, that sometimes historic sites are used as hodgepodge dumping grounds. You got an old ship's propeller, put it in San Jacinto. You got some old naval guns, let's pretend they're the twin sisters. Just stick them in there. And that is counterproductive. And I think that both Michael Strutt and Chris McMasters will be talking about that sort of thing today. So what we're trying to do today is to bring the energetic, emotion-laden, myth-infused popular history together with the hardcore, academic, scholarly, archaeologically based history, and try to put the two together so that each reinforce the other rather than being antagonistic towards each other. There's no reason that they have to be antagonistic. We can use that energy and we can use that precision to better use our energy and to better focus our precision. And so, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Paul Hutton, Professor of History at the University of New Mexico, the author of many books and articles on the American West and on Texas, the producer and participant in a host of documentaries. It says here 150. I don't think that in my life I could have participated in 150 documentaries, but it would have been really fun. And so here's a guy who's turned his avocation into a vocation. And as a bird dog man told me in San Angelo a couple of years ago, if you can turn your avocation into a vocation and get paid for having fun, then you've really made a good choice and you're a lucky man. So here's one of the luckiest men in America, Paul Andrew Hutton.
Thank you, Jim. Jim and I go way back to our puppy days in the history business. It's great to be here. I want to thank the committee for inviting me, and for Jim for inviting me, and to you for being here. I thought today, since we have so many folks here who are experts on the Battle of San Jacinto, which I am not, and readily admit that I'm not, despite my seeming ability to pretend to be an expert on almost every topic. Nevertheless, I thought I would talk about historic preservation in the broadest possible way. I'll use two examples from my personal past of two places that I've been intimately involved with in my life. One, the Little Bighorn up in Montana, and the other, the Alamo here. And hopefully the travails of both of those sites will relate to the problems that are confronted by the San Jacinto site, which strikes me as a site, despite its age and the fact that the large monument has been there for so long, that is still in a historic preservation sense in its infancy. It's just, I think, right now, thought is coming together on how to engage in preservation there and what story needs to be told. And it's that argument over story that has provided me with a living, and I think also goes to the heart of what historic preservation is about and why it's so difficult. There are always so many stakeholders in any story, and in a country as diverse and large and great as ours, they are sometimes in conflict, even though their goal would seem to be similar. San Jacinto is a historic place. It's a heroic place, and much of historic preservation has to do with the heroic, although in the last generation, certainly, we've been moving away from that. Thomas Carlyle, back in 1840, wrote that universal history, the history of what man accomplished in this world, is at bottom the history of the great men who have worked here. This is a view that in my world, the academy, is no longer considered valid. History is now viewed through the lens of social, racial, class conflict, institutional structure, broad trends. There's been an effort, certainly over the last quarter century, if not the last 50 years, to replace the strong-willed individual with a broader thematic story. That would be the story of America. So the individual is lost, and humans are simply controlled by events. And if they are used at all, they're simply used as an example, a representational form. Heroes are still used, but again, with their individuality downplayed, they're simply a type. Now, how you could downplay the individuality of someone like Sam Houston is pretty remarkable, because there are a few people in American history who were so stridently individualistic and whose personal passions had such an impact upon our national story. But nevertheless, most professional historians would view that approach, the heroic approach used through a character like Houston, as totally irrelevant and the stuff of popularizers. Nevertheless, all the book lists, be they the New York Times list or the Amazon list, are full of nothing but stories about individuals. There's a whole television channel devoted to biography. Biography and the lives of humans remains at the core of all historical discourse. And I know this will shock you, but the academy in which I work is totally and completely wrong, has been wrong-headed for 50 years, and seems to show no signs of reform at any time soon. But nevertheless, they are so wrong that they are increasingly irrelevant, except for Crisp and I. Now, I'm an orphan, which alleviates me from both knowledge and guilt. So I'm not burdened by what anyone did in the past, especially here in the United States, because I'm an orphan from even another country. So I always tell my students that they ought to be ashamed of everything their ancestors did, and I feel really sorry for them. But I don't even want to know what my ancestors did. But you know, the heroic and the preservation of sites that are connected to the heroic is very much a form of ancestor worship. And much of what we do is entirely a result of that. This is not new. Primitive man believed his forefathers had strength and wisdom greater than his own. Now, in our particular case here in the United States of America in 2012, I think that truth is self-evident. But it has seemed self-evident to almost all people. The heroes of Homer, of course, defined who the Greeks were and what their national story was. The tales of King Arthur and his Round Table provided a shining example to England of what it was, what it might be in the future. And we have also had this propensity. And we're a young nation, and we are a nation that has come together from many places, completely mongrelized, bastardized people, which is a wonderful thing, not a bad thing. It's a wonderful thing. Thus, though, there is always conflict in our story and how we define ourselves. But through our ancestor worship, we come up with a series of shared values that so long as folks buy into, everybody gets to play in the playground. Our greatest heroes, in fact, are figures of a secular religion. And in America, a nation that, despite all the posturing during political campaigns, a nation that really does try to step outside of the religious, has embraced a secular religion, which is its history. So we, in our approach to our greatest heroes, despite their flaws, we have a semi-religious approach. We expect perfection of them, and then we're shocked, of course, when they aren't that way. Now, of course, in our current political discourse in our lives over the last half century, we're shocked when anyone actually behaves well. But in our historical discourse, we're shocked when our forefathers don't behave well. To attack their perfection of a Washington, of a Lee, of a Lincoln, is given a name. People are called debunkers, or even worse, revisionists. I was once a revisionist when I was young, but then I evolved out of that and morphed into some kind of new creature that's even more scary than being a revisionist. I think Crisp is still a revisionist, which is a dangerous place to be at his age. We carefully preserve the homes of these heroes, their beds, their clothing. This is not a new impulse. Now, in the 19th century, folks liked to collect hair. I wish I had collected more as I've aged. And locks of hair were given out. Custer was constantly pestered for locks of his long flowing locks before the Sioux alleviated him of all of it. Thaddeus Stevens, the great abolitionist, once pestered so much for his hair, simply took off his wig and threw it at the folks. This sense of religiosity can be seen in something like when they were carrying Lincoln across from Ford's Theater to the boarding house where he died. A young boy was seen to be sopping up the blood on the street with newspapers. And I remember, many of you may have had the same experience, when you go into the room in which Lincoln died, they have carefully preserved the pillowcase with his blood on it. And it is just such, it still sends a chill up me to think about it. It's such a moving experience to actually see Lincoln's blood. And that is a common experience for many people. Often people have been seen in prayer before the Lincoln Memorial, and you know, you don't have to have studied Greek archaeology or Roman archaeology to understand that that is a religious shrine to Lincoln, with the gigantic statue of him sitting there almost like Zeus. That's exactly what he is, of course. I mean, in this secular religion of America, the creator of the new nation sitting there like Zeus, and people pray there. I was once there very late one evening, I think it was like 1 in the morning or something, and I saw a young couple engaging in a different kind of religious activity there that seemed to them at least very spiritual. And of course, if you've also been to Washington, you've seen how the National Archives preserve the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. South Sea Islanders had carvings of their history, and I think our presentation of our great founding documents is very much that way. And I'm charmed by the fact that, you know, they descend in case of nuclear attack into a vault where they will be protected from the atomic blast, so that when we're all bacon bits and aliens come down, you know, from some planet in 5,000 years, they will find our documents preserved there, and we'll all be gone. And I wonder what they'll think, if they do think. Despite the way we revere our heroes, we also have to make them common in a way. We don't want them to be common, you know. We don't want them to be average, but yet they have to be, because they always have to be men and women of the people. You know, Ben Franklin, who was always called Dr. Franklin in his own day, is now just Ben Franklin to us, and in a Disney cartoon he has a mouse as a friend. We have Andy, we have Abe, we have Teddy, who hated to be called by that name, Harry. And so the nickname is a common point. If we don't do nicknames, then we do initials: TR, FDR, JFK, LBJ. All of them show an informality between the great leader and the people. Nicknames: Old Hickory, Old Rough and Ready, Father Abraham, Mars Robert, suggest a kind of patriarchal affection for these heroes. And sometimes our leaders will insist upon this to their detriment. Thus, President Carter was always Jimmy Carter, and that didn't exactly work for him. In direct contradiction to our nature, which of course is the success motif, we admire the grand failure. And one of the reasons that Sam Houston is such a great hero, such a perfect hero, is that he is so deeply flawed and such an enormous failure. If you think through the list of presidents that we had running this country, if you want to understand the American Civil War, all you have to do is look at that list of stooges that were in charge of the republic there leading up to it. I try to tell my students that if you really want to understand why individuals are important in history, just look at James Buchanan and Abraham Lincoln, and I think it's all wrapped up in those two lives right there. One a completely inadequate failure, another almost godlike figure who did almost everything right. But nevertheless, we like them to fail, not quite as much as Buchanan failed, but fail and then come back. We have a sentimental weakness for lost causes. Thus, I think the state of Texas lavishes far more attention on the Alamo, the lost cause, than it does on San Jacinto, the great victory that changed not only the destiny of Texas, but of the entire nation, which I'll talk about at the end of my talk. Heroes who fail, of course, appear more human, and thus they're more like ourselves, and we like that, but then we want them to get on with the business. This is not new. Joan of Arc, King Arthur, the Round Table is deeply flawed. Nelson at Trafalgar, death at the moment of greatest victory, but he had to go because he had that pesky mistress back in London. Our greatest heroes have all known the sting of defeat: Washington, Jackson, Lincoln, Lee, Teddy Roosevelt. And we admire our heroes, though, for fighting the uphill battle and for winning. The mores and morals of our heroes may vary with the time. Certainly Sam Houston is a character of very contradictory moral behavior. And Andrew Jackson, his mentor, was a notorious gambler, a drinker, a curser, a duelist who killed several men in duels, and he ran off with another man's wife. Generally, these are not going to get you on the $20 bill, but I think he's on the 20. I'm a college professor. I don't get those big denomination bills. He's either on the 10 or the 20. Lincoln, of course, was famous for telling dirty jokes, which often you don't get a sense of at the Lincoln Memorial, although I believe the young couple that I saw had picked up on that. And this group that we give a name to, the debunkers, have usually concerned themselves with such sins as drinking and adultery and neglected far more important issues. I mean, there's kind of a salaciousness to that. It's the National Enquirer kind of history. And I mean, I like that as much as anybody. It's great. But you know, there's something far more important in the fact that Thomas Jefferson had a long-standing relationship with a mistress who was the half-sister of his dead wife and who was also his slave. And she fathered him several children. And the story of that family and what happens to them and why that was kept a secret for so long and why people continue to argue about it today is, of course, goes to the heart of who we are as Americans. So indeed, the moral failings or moral triumphs of our heroes tell us much about ourselves. And I think always when we're looking at the past, especially the heroic past, we are really looking at ourselves. History is not dead. History is not on life support. History is, in fact, young and vigorous and living. History lives. It's a living organism. There's nothing dead about it at all. And what you're engaging in the effort to preserve San Jacinto is part of that life force. I mean, history is a life force. And as with all things that live, it changes. It has to change. And that keeps people like Crisp and I employed. But it also makes the story of places like San Jacinto, like the Alamo, and like Little Bighorn fascinating. Because as interpretation changes, as our attitudes change, as we evolve as a people, as a nation, so alters the past. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It's not a negative at all. There's no changing. There are facts, but then it's what you make of them. Well, let's look at a couple of places that are very famous in the West, the Little Bighorn and the Alamo. In fact, there are no two places, I think, that are more famous. They are the two most well-known sites around the world connected with the story of the American West. I believe the story of the American West is the American creation myth, again, meant in the broadest possible sense. This is what defines us, makes us unique as a people, at least up until the turn of the last century. I find it fascinating, of course, that our two greatest stories coming out of that are stories of defeat, in which Americans go into somebody else's neighborhood, mess around, get themselves killed, and then build a big monument to their defeat. The defeat, though, is, of course, always vitally important because the defeat leads to immediate victory. Well, no one was more famous in his own time and immediately afterward than George Armstrong Custer. Today, disdained as a symbol of military ignorance and brutality, he was in his own day the boy general, the Golden Cavalier, the hero of the Civil War, who was a major general, 2 stars at age 25, who had done as much as anyone in the Union Army to save the Union and free the slaves. He went west with the reorganization of the Army and became lieutenant colonel of the 7th Cavalry, a new elite regiment that had been created to fight the Plains Indians for an expanding nation. It had taken 300 years to get to the Mississippi and just barely beyond. The Civil War had slowed the onslaught of Americans moving west onto the Buffalo Range of the Indians. But now what had taken 300 years to get to one point was going to be over with in 25 years, in one generation, faster than anyone could imagine. And 50 million buffalo were gone in a twinkling. The southern herd gone by 1874, the northern herd gone by 1883. The commissary, the life force that had held the Plains Indians together, was eradicated. And thousands upon hundreds of thousands of people came to this new land, the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the American West. More people were coming into Boston and Philadelphia and New York on boats every month in the 1870s and 1880s than there were Indians in the entire American West. So this is not a force that can be stopped. This is a massive human movement that is going to overwhelm anything in its path. George Armstrong Custer embraces the West. He throws off that blue Union coat and puts on buckskins, and he already wore his hair long like the plainsmen did, so he didn't cut it. He loved that, give the Indians something worthy of taking. That's why they wore their hair long, the plainsmen. He had read James Fenimore Cooper. He had read about Davy Crockett and Kit Carson, and he wanted to be just like them. And he embraced the West and Western development, and that's why he's the perfect hero for the West. He was not freelancing in 1876 in the wilds of Montana. He was there at the bidding of his government on the direct orders of his president, who later betrayed him, U.S. Grant, and the Congress of the United States. And he died with 260 of his men in obedience to the orders of the Republic, and they died as heroic soldiers. And that was the story that was put forward immediately after his death in 1876. He and his troops were martyrs to manifest destiny, martyrs to the growth of the American nation. And indeed, his death at Little Bighorn brought to an end the Indian Wars. What had taken 300 years was over in 10 years. And certainly for the Sioux, they had been fighting the Americans for a generation, and they were completely defeated within 6 months, once Custer had died and troops were sent to finally finish the job. His legend was helped considerably by his talented and beautiful wife, Elizabeth Bacon Custer, who devoted the rest of her long life to preserving his legend and silencing his critics. And there were many critics, especially in the military as an institution, which wanted to blame him for everything and absolve themselves for responsibility for what had happened at Little Bighorn. But, and this included the president. But she silenced them all, and she wrote 3 best-selling books, Boots and Saddles, the most famous, all of which became huge bestsellers. And so by the time she dies in 1932, this woman was born when John Tyler was president of the United States. She died when Franklin Roosevelt was president of the United States. What a life. What a life. She was a widow at 34. She devoted her whole life from 34 till she was 90 to preserving the memory of her husband. And finally, they buried her at West Point with a little headstone right next to the towering monument that is there for her husband. And she must have been completely content because she had built that monument. And everyone in the Army that might criticize Custer had kept silent so long as she lived. Well, she outlived them all. But once she had passed, it began. A man named Frederick Van de Water, a very talented novelist, wrote a book called Glory Hunter in 1932, the very year of her death, castigating Custer as a megalomaniac, as an ambitious, preening glory hunter who had led better men to their deaths in search of his own personal glory. And other novelists and historians followed in the wake of Van de Water's scathing critique of Custer in the book Glory Hunter. But Hollywood and popular culture, now becoming so important as an arbiter of the American past, clung to the heroic Custer, best exemplified in They Died with Their Boots On, with Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland, released in December of 1941. This story of heroic soldiers sacrificing themselves to the Indians in in an effort actually to protect the Indians from venal capitalists, struck a responsive chord within America that was marching out of the Great Depression and into the Second World War. In fact, the movie was released the same week as Pearl Harbor. And Custer's sacrifice seemed perfect for that time. And so Errol Flynn defined the Custer story in a nation that was captivated with sacrifice and patriotism. But Hollywood also then had a dramatic part in changing attitudes about Custer with the 1950 film Broken Arrow, starring Jimmy Stewart and Jeff Chandler, beautiful film made by Delmer Daves, about the friendship between Tom Jeffords and Cochise, the great Chiricahua leader, and the great injustice that had been done to the Chiricahuas. And Broken Arrow was so successful, not only as a film, but in making money, and Chandler got an Academy Award nomination for his role as Cochise, that Hollywood now did a whole series of films about Indian heroes. Sitting Bull was played by that great Italian actor, J. Carrol Naish. Crazy Horse was played by Victor Mature, and on it went, with Custer increasingly becoming the villain in these stories. As the symbol of the Indian Wars, he now morphed into the villain of the story, the counter to these very heroic and noble Indian chiefs. Part of what was going on in the 1950s and 60s, though, especially in the 50s, was an effort to use the West and the so-called Indian problem, which was perceived to be completely over, even though it's not, in terms of Indian civil rights, but nevertheless to use that as a vehicle to really comment on the American civil rights movement, the African-American civil rights movement. But that was too dangerous in Hollywood, but you could do cowboy movies, and people wouldn't notice. Indeed, it proved a very effective way to enter into a discussion of race in Hollywood. Historians were not silent, and in 1969, a book was written by a novelist and popular historian, a librarian by trade, named Dee Brown, who was kind of a mentor to me and someone I admire enormously. And one of the reasons I admired Dee so enormously is that he did what we all dream of doing with a book. He wrote a book that changed the attitudes of a nation. One night, America went to bed thinking one thing about Indians and the Indian Wars, and Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee came out, and the next morning, America woke up and it had an entirely different attitude. And all across the nation, Indian studies programs burst forth on campuses, and a whole new field of history was created. And all of that was due to Dee Brown and his marvelous book, which has been translated into 80 languages and is still in print today, and sold millions and millions and millions of copies. And he kept living in the same kind of dumpy house he had in Little Rock even after that success. He was a wonderful gentleman. Vine Deloria wrote a book called Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto, that also contributed to this. And now the Army in the West was increasingly presented as villainous. And Dee had not presented Custer as villainous in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, but he certainly wasn't heroic. And Hollywood now completely went against Custer in films like Little Big Man, made in 1970, which is Arthur Pynn's Epic of the Frontier, in which Custer is a raving lunatic, a madman, and a racist. And indeed, all the soldiers under his command are the same. Well, and so it's against this background of change that the Custer Battlefield National Monument was created. It was named the site itself on rolling hills in south central Montana was named a national military cemetery in 1879. And General Phil Sheridan, who had been Custer's commander, mentor, and dear friend, and who was strangely silent when the military establishment attacked Custer after Little Bighorn, I think as an act of atonement, was determined to make that site into a national shrine. He sent soldiers back, and this was a very dangerous time to be going back there immediately, to bury the bodies, because everyone had kind of been left where they fell. They had thrown a little dirt on them and some sagebrush, but they hadn't done much for them because they were getting out of there in 1876. And so the bodies were reinterred, and a national cemetery was formed there in 1879. Finally, the site was marked with marble markers, which was one of the most heroic physical feats of the frontier in America. In 1890, marble markers for all 262 men who died there were hauled by train out to Montana by wagon to the site, and they were erected on the site. And if you go there today, the Little Bighorn remains one of the most beautiful and haunting places in all of the American West. And you walk that field and you see the markers where each man fell. And often they're clustered together. There's like 2, 3. And your imagination can run through how those bunkies, buddies, had grouped together in these final little personal last stands. And I've done that many times. And then I thought to myself as I counted all the markers, wait a minute, there's 260 here on the battlefield, and there were 260 some men killed under Custer's command, but only 212 were with Custer. The other 50 were killed with another detachment 4 miles away. But they put all of them on the battlefield, so all those bunkies that are together there, those 2 markers, they just threw in an extra marker. And the Park Service knows this, of course. Everyone knows it. I mean, it's not like it's a secret, because folks can count. But now, of course, the markers are there, and the markers are themselves historic, because they were placed there in 1890. And so what we have at Little Bighorn is an agreed-upon lie. An agreed-upon lie that is completely supported and fostered by the United States government, which created the lie. And it's an inconsequential lie, I suppose, unless you're a 12-year-old kid like I was, thinking about those bunkies dying together, getting tears in my little eyes, And then I discovered the truth and had to go into therapy, where I still am. In 1933, the site was transferred to the Interior Department after the creation of the National Park Service, and so we have Franklin Roosevelt to thank for that. And in 1946, it became Custer Battlefield National Monument, rather than just a cemetery. And up to that time, it had been under the control of the United States Army. So the Army had preserved that site and made it into a shrine to Custer and his men. In 1952, as was the habit at the time, a visitor's center and little museum was built on the battlefield, of course, right smack in the middle of the battlefield. They didn't put it right on top of Custer Hill. They had already, of course, Custer really did die right on top of the hill, but in another agreed-upon lie, his marker is halfway down the hill, because they did a mass grave at the top of the hill, and they also put a road through the top of the hill. So those engaged in preservation are, of course, the worst enemies of the site, but on the other hand, without them, there would be no site. So it's a tortured relationship. And so the museum was erected right in the middle of the battlefield. Well, as times changed and the attitude toward Custer changed, and he started to become, the butt of late-night comic jokes, Custer wore an arrow shirt, there was no place for his name at the site. And in 1991, the name of the site was changed to Little Bighorn National Monument to erase Custer from the site. And an Indian Memorial Commission was appointed by the Secretary of the Interior to establish and oversee the design for an Indian memorial at Little Bighorn. I was appointed as one of the 10 members of that commission. All the members of the commission were members of tribes, Indian tribes that had been involved in the battle, except for me. I was from the tribe called Historian. And so I was the token on that committee, but I soon rallied with my colleagues, and we engaged in an acrimonious and continuous battle with the National Park Service over the erection of the Indian Memorial. 500 submissions came in. The major struggle was over funding, because Congress, hold on now, this is going to really surprise you. Now, Congress had changed the name, in this act of political correctness, that it was the right thing to do, but they did it for all the wrong reasons. And then Congress approved this Indian Memorial and established this commission, of which I was a member of, and we were paid for this activity I remember it so well, $35 a day. That was our per diem. I was thinking about this recently with all this stuff coming about the GSA party in Vegas and $1 million spent. We got $35 a day. And when we were judging the 500 submissions for the Indian Memorial, all the artistic renderings, they locked us in a room. They did for a whole week, and they wouldn't let us out. It's like a jury. And that's what we were. We were a jury. They let us out at night, and they would bring lunch in to us, and they bring us these ham sandwiches. We're in Billings, Montana, gourmet food all the way around. In the winter, Billings, Montana, and so they would bring in these sandwiches, and then they deducted the deli sandwiches from our $35 a day. But I was honored and pleased to serve the Republic in this way. Well, we struggled then with the Park Service overfunding because, of course, Congress had created all this, but they hadn't dedicated a penny to do anything about it. There was no funding mechanism. And we felt that the government that had erected the monument to Custer and his men, as they rightly should have, should also erect the monument to the Indians who had given their lives defending their homeland there at the Little Bighorn. And this went on for 2 years. And finally, the federal government was embarrassed enough to come up with $1.5 million to build the memorial. And it is fitting that they did. And I must tell you, though, that as someone engaged in historic preservation, I never returned. One, I was mad at the Park Service. We've kissed and made up now. It's kind of like the DRT and me. That's another story you'll get in a second. But I didn't go there for 10 years. And I didn't go. And when I finally went, I just felt terrible. Because there was the Indian Memorial, and while I myself had written that it was a living memorial to triumph, to loss, and to renewal, and while I believed in it, and while I had dedicated really a decade of my life to erecting it, I was melancholy because I had erected something else upon this sacred ground. I had become part of what I am standing here criticizing. I had disturbed the place and made something new, because everything you build is an intrusion. And then I immediately became persona non grata up there again because they wanted to expand the visitor center. And I was a prominent member of their Friends group there, which I resigned from because the Friends group was supporting this effort, and I knew if they put $5 more million into that visitor center, they wouldn't tear it down and move it away. That's what needs to be done with it. It doesn't need to be improved. It needs to be eradicated. And the land returned to the way it was. And so the struggle at Little Bighorn continues. It just began when Custer got killed. Well, Little Bighorn is a rural area, much like San Jacinto, although Little Bighorn, even though there's a railroad track nearby and a freeway, is not in many ways as threatened as San Jacinto is. San Jacinto, I think, combines both the rural and the urban. But a place that is completely urban is the other place that I have dedicated much of my life to, which shows that indeed this therapy hopefully will work out so that I stop studying places where everybody gets killed. And that is, of course, the Alamo. Now, the Alamo is one of the great symbols, certainly here in Texas. I don't need to tell you about that, but it is nationally as well. And I know you folks here believe you own it, but there's a national ownership to it as well in terms of the story of the Alamo. Although much of that comes from a 1955 television show with Fez Parker. Now, a cultural battle has raged over the meaning of the symbol of the Alamo, but an equally contentious struggle has also been waged over the physical building itself. These combatants first sought to preserve the shrine from demolition itself. So in this case, you're trying to preserve something that exists, not leave something the way it was. But since they saved it, they have engaged in a protracted struggle over interpretation and presentation. And this is a battle that is not anywhere near over. So the Battle of the Alamo continues. Now, of course, you know the buildings were heavily damaged in the Battle of March the 6th, and the damage was further compounded in May of 1836 as the retreating Mexican army had demolition teams destroy as much of the fort as they could. They were not looking toward historic preservation. The buildings that survived were soon reoccupied by local residents of the community, and they'd lived there before the battle. Others scavenged the ruins for building materials so that by 1846, hardly anything of the Alamo compound, a vast fortress, was left. And then, just like at Little Bighorn, the cavalry rode to the rescue. The annexation of Texas by the United States in 1845, the resultant unfortunate conflict with our neighbors to the south, brought some 2,000 troops to San Antonio under the command of Brigadier General John Wool. And by late 1846, Wool's quartermaster department was using the Alamo as a supply depot. Repairs were undertaken on the sturdy convent building, the Long Barracks, so that by 1848 they had been entirely refurbished and re-roofed. Major Edwin Babbitt, who assumed the duties of San Antonio quartermaster in June of 1849, took one look at the joint and recommended that every building be demolished and new storage facilities be constructed. There's a good government bureaucrat for you. Tear the damn thing down. He was fortunately overruled, not because of the crime against humanity that would have been to tear down the Alamo, no, but because, budgets are tight and you ought to just use what the hell you got, and we're not going to build you anything new, so make do. And so he was overruled, and he was ordered to repair the place. And so he employed two local Germans, John Fries, a builder and contractor, and David Rusi, a stonemason, to renovate the chapel. Fries and Rusi's workers removed great piles of debris that in 1836 had served as an artillery rampart, and thus removing all the kind of stuff that, Greg Dimmitt would just go nuts to get his hands on. They raised the walls to the same height, constructed a roof, and built 2 stone pillars inside the chapel to support this covering. A second floor was added, with 2 new windows on the front, and offices were added on the ground floor. The most important change, though, was the addition of a gable, or a hump, to the top of the chapel's front parapet. This simple gable soon became so identified with the Alamo that artists and filmmakers dared not omit it from their renderings of the battle, despite the fact that nothing even remotely resembling it ever existed before the Army renovation. The top of the Alamo was just absolutely flat, as flat as the table in front of you, alas. But if you want to do that in a movie, everyone's going to think you're nuts. Don't you know what the Alamo looks like? Have you ever seen a postcard? Don't you watch the National Geographic Channel? So the Army Taco Bell'd the Alamo, and the gable is now one of America's greatest iconographic symbols, inspiring countless architectural copies. So now there are Alamos all around the country. Some guy built in a subdivision in Albuquerque, built an Alamo. He's got an Alamo house. I tried to buy it, but my wife vetoed the project. So indeed, the very representation of the Alamo, the very way it looks, just like the markers on the Custer Field, is an agreed upon lie. It's the way, we all agree on this. Well, the Army abandoned the place in 1879, moving the quartermaster depot to Fort Sam Houston. And they had paid the Catholic Church a handsome rent on the buildings. And with that income gone, the church sold the convent building to San Antonio businessman Honoré Grenet. By this time, the west wall had been completely demolished and replaced by new buildings. And in 1871, the city purchased much of the Alamo compound that was left and turned it into a plaza. Grenet leased the chapel and used it as a warehouse, and so they stored cheese and ham hocks and fat bacon in the Alamo, right over there, right next to the Limburger cheese. That's where Davy Crockett made his last stand, right there. Killed 800 Mexicans before they got him, right there. And so it was great. You didn't have to go out into the plaza to get a snack. You could get a snack right inside the chapel. Hugo and Smeltzer purchased the convent, now called the Long Barracks, and continued its use as a store. But they sold the church to the state of Texas in 1883 for $20,000. Hell, I would have given them 20 grand for the place. Although the Alamo Chapel was saved from being a warehouse by this public purchase, the convent building it had a wooden facade with little cannons painted on it and everything. It was like come shop at the Alamo. Continued to hover to the north, and by the turn of the century, there was much talk of tearing it down. Two heroines now strode forth to save the Alamo. Adina de Zavala, founder of the San Antonio chapter of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, granddaughter of the first vice president of the Republic, began a campaign to raise funds to purchase the convent building from Hugo and Smeltzer. The boys wanted $75,000 for it. That's a lot of money back in the day. But efforts to raise the money, you know how that goes, went slowly. Then in 1903, while these fundraising efforts were underway, an Eastern hotel syndicate made a counteroffer. They were going to put a high-rise hotel right next to the Alamo. So it'd be great. It's like a Hyatt, you know, and you could just walk right out the lobby that you'd be in the Alamo. What could be better? City fathers of San Antonio loved this idea. There you go. De Zavala's heroic efforts to raise the necessary funds to purchase the convent before the hotel got it went nowhere. A bill to provide $5,000 to cover the option on the place passed both houses of the Texas legislature, but the governor of Texas, S.W.T. Lanham, vetoed it. Why would you use taxpayers' money for historic preservation? Makes no sense. Others felt that since the Alamo was a tourist attraction for San Antonio, they should pay for it. Why should the rest of the good people of Texas pay for the Alamo? Then Clara Driscoll, a 22-year-old daughter of a South Texas cattle baron, stepped forward and paid the $75,000 herself and bought the Alamo. She also assumed responsibility for taxes and insurance. And in her deed for the property she had inserted, it is distinctly understood that this property is purchased by Clara Driscoll for the use and benefit of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, and it is to be used by them for the purpose of making a park about the Alamo and for no other purpose whatsoever. Please note here that in the story of the preservation of the Custer story and the preservation of the story of the Alamo, women are leading the charge, and that the effort for historic preservation and commemorating the past, much as it had gone into the hands of the ladies after the American Civil War, continued in the hands of the ladies. Well, the bold action of Clara Driscoll shamed the Texas government into appropriating $75,000 in 1905 to purchase the property. The state then entrusted the convent building as well as the already owned chapel to the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, quote, to be maintained by them in good order and repair without charge to the state. Looking out for your budget. You folks don't have an income tax here in this state, do you? 8% over where I live. I just had to write the check yesterday just to kill her. But if you had that income tax, you could put a little more money into historic preservation, I guess. Just an idea for you. Because I know how much Texans love New Mexicans coming over and kind of helping you out there with a few ideas. But we appreciate all the times you'd like marched armies into New Mexico over the years, too. Driscoll and de Zavala, having saved the Alamo, now turned on each other. De Zavala, captivated by the mission days, wanted to restore the convent to its original appearance, or at least the fantasy she had of what its original appearance was. She hoped to emphasize the convent as the main Alamo building and the place where the hardest fighting took place. Not untrue. Driscoll and her supporters, however, wanted to tear down the convent building, incorrectly arguing that it was never part of the Alamo. They were especially anxious to demolish at least the convent's second story so that the chapel, with its glorious hump, would be higher and thus more prominent. The debate also took on racial undertones, with de Zavala representing a Hispanic vision of the multicultural roles of the Alamo through history, and Driscoll representing an Anglo view of the site that focused solely upon the 1836 battle. This debate, dubbed the Second Battle of the Alamo by the press, grew increasingly heated and unpleasant. Governor Oscar Colquitt now boldly entered the fray, deciding in favor of restoring the two-story convent building, or Long Barracks, as it had been called at the time of the battle. The wooden facade was removed from the building, but restoration moved slowly because there were no funds. Then in 1913, when Governor Colquitt was out of the state on vacation, his lieutenant governor, in sympathy with the Driscoll faction, authorized the destruction of the second story of the convent. And in went the bulldozers, and ironically, The very people responsible for saving the Alamo now demolished some of the last remnants of its historic walls. Having secured the physical representation of the image of the Alamo, the Driscoll forces then moved to purge Adina de Zavala and her adherents from the ranks of the DRT. De Zavala and her chapter of the DRT were forbidden by court injunction from claiming any association with the Alamo, and they were replaced as custodians of the historic site by the Alamo Mission chapter. And so ended the Second Battle of the Alamo with the Anglos and their vision of the fortress, centering on the chapel, triumphant. Well, the Texas Sesquicentennial renewed interest in preservation at the Alamo. I got involved in the fray. I had a book out, an autobiography of Davy Crockett that I wrote an introduction for. Best-selling book I ever did, and of course, stupidly, I took 500 up front rather than a cut of the action all the way. Things like in its 50th printing now, just drives me nuts. And it was the best-selling book in the Alamo as well, this little edition of Davy Crockett's autobiography with my really nice introduction, I think we could say. Someone read it. One of the daughters read it. And was so horrified that I said Davy Crockett was captured and he wasn't educated, but he was executed, in my introduction that they wrote my publisher and informed them that the book, even though it was the bestseller in the DRT bookstore, was banned. So, banned at the Alamo. I mean, this is... I was later, as the critics of the DRT grew more vociferous and heated, I started looking better and better. And I was later reinstated, allowed to give a speech on February 23rd with candles, in the room to a special group. And I never learned the secret handshake, but I was really moved by the whole experience, actually. I really was. And my book is back in there, and I'm still not making a penny off of it. So I've been out, and now I'm sort of back in. So it's a wonderful place to be. A person that was even more hated than me, though, by far, was a historic preservation consultant from Illinois named Gary Foreman, who unveiled a plan to renovate the entire Alamo Plaza. The city and the state were intrigued, but the daughters were not amused. Declared a DRT spokeswoman. Mr. Foreman doesn't understand that this is a sacred shrine. He wants to turn the Alamo into a tourist trap. Mr. Foreman is not a Texan. When my book was being banned because I had dared to say that Crockett was captured and executed, one of the DRT spokespeople came out and said that everyone knows that Davy Crockett had died exactly as he did in the John Wayne film, blowing up the powder magazine in the chapel. If you remember the John Wayne film, the chapel is blown to smithereens. The only part of the Alamo still standing is blown up in the movie, and so this is the story. Foreman responded in kind, characterizing the DRT as a, quote, tea club running a famous historic site. Well, this did not make him friends. He failed in his crusade, but his actions, and Gary's one of those guys, a lot of his ideas are good, but let's just say that the presentation never quite works to his benefit. He's kind of his own worst enemy. He failed in his crusade, but his actions did indeed lead to dramatic changes at the Alamo. The DRT rededicated itself to preservation efforts, completely redesigned the museum exhibits. The chapel, once cluttered with paintings and artifacts, was stripped to bare essentials to enhance the visitor experience. And with 3 to 5 million visitors coming every year, this is a daunting, daunting task. And the DRT really redoubled its efforts and really, I thought, did a marvelous job in telling the story of the battle, especially under the new curator that they had, Dr. Bruce Winders. It professionalized every aspect of the interpretation and preservation of the site, and I'm very sorry to see the current troubles that they have found themselves in. Foreman, though, came back, returning to the fray in 2008 with yet another bold plan to redesign Alamo Plaza. Now he wanted to go into Alamo Plaza, tear down a lot of the buildings that were around there, including moving the historic Maverick buildings right across from the Alamo, and rebuild in Disneyland fashion the South Wall and other buildings so that folks don't have to go all the way to Brackettville to see a movie set recreation of the battle. I mean, in fact, sometimes those who love a place the most are the ones I think you can see that love it to death and are its sometimes morph into a danger. Foreman, once hated by the DRT far more than me, and certainly as much as the British rocker Ozzy Osbourne, who in 1982 relieved himself in a drunken stupor against an Alamo wall, which, by the way, I think led to his arrest, at least briefly, and most importantly inspired a wonderful song by Texas swing group Asleep at the Wheel entitled Don't Go There, which I think is an Alamo song everyone in this room needs to hear. With the 175th anniversary of the battle, of course, warfare broke out at the Alamo once again. The DRT, rocked by an internal struggle between members over a 2007 master plan study on historic preservation at the site, and especially concerned over cracks that had appeared in the roof that had not been repaired, began fighting with each other in a very public way. And in a particular act of bad timing, the DRT also filed for trademark protection for the name The Alamo, right at the time that they were engaging in their own civil war. The result, of course, as you know, was intervention by the state of Texas, Governor Rick Perry reminding the DRT that they might still manage the Alamo, but that the people of Texas actually own it. And now, of course, the land office has moved in to take over actual control. But again, the story continues because the site lives. And the fight over how it will be interpreted, just like the struggle over Little Bighorn and how it will be interpreted, will continue not just in our lifetime, but for generations yet to come. It seems to me that San Jacinto is, in a way, still in its infancy in terms of historic preservation, despite the grand and marvelous monument that resides there, which is a representation of a previous time when we marked historic sites with, grand and glorious markers, pedestals, so to speak. The San Jacinto field has never, though, had the kind of loving care and detail appointed to it to return it to its natural state, to any kind of representation of what it is as a battlefield. This can be done, despite the fact that there are many stakeholders involved in the contest over the area, despite the fact that there are contested historical visions of it, it can be done. And the example, of course, of how anything can be done is Gettysburg, and what happened there in terms of the removal of a very large visitor center, the bringing down of a huge tower that loomed over the place, and the restoration of the fields to the way they had appeared in 1863. You can't go back. The past doesn't exist anymore. It lives, but it doesn't exist anymore, just like you can't go back to being 16. And sometimes you can remember it, and sometimes your memories are even accurate, although rarely. But nevertheless, you can't restore yourself, and we can't completely restore what existed before, but we can try. And I would urge this audience, and I would urge all Texans, that I think the key to success in that struggle is to step outside of the very strong nationalism that resides within the state of Texas, which is a wonderful thing, and which is what makes, I think, Texans distinct, the only Americans who, if you met them in a bistro in Paris and you asked them where they are from, they would not say the United States, they would say Texas, of course, as well you should. But nevertheless, the struggle for historic preservation at a site like San Jacinto is a national struggle. And the San Jacinto site is a national site. And the San Jacinto site is a part of our national history, and it's a very, very important part. It is far more important than the Alamo. It is far more important than the Little Bighorn. In fact, there are very few sites in all of American history, battle sites, that are as important. Chalmette, the Battle of New Orleans, is one, also a place that is terribly threatened by development. Gettysburg is the other, and I would argue to you that San Jacinto is perhaps the third or fourth most important battle site in America. The Battle of San Jacinto does not just win Texas its independence for its decade as a republic. The Battle of San Jacinto sets up, of course, the Mexican War that will follow. The Mexican War that follows then, of course, leads America to achieve its continental destiny and overreach the entire continent, becoming, as Thomas Jefferson had foreseen, an empire for liberty in which millions and millions and millions and millions of people would come from all over the world, and they're still coming, and make what I actually truly believe is the greatest hope for all mankind and the greatest nation and the greatest force for good on the face of the earth. And without San Jacinto, and without the victory then in the Mexican War that leads to our continental destiny, America does not become a great power. America is not there then in the 20th century to meet the threats of both fascism and the Nazis and Japanese militarism, but also of communism, and to struggle for freedom throughout the world. And so the Battle of San Jacinto sets in motion all that, and everything we are today and everything we will be in the future looks back to those 18 minutes on the field not very far from here. Thank you so much.